This is the before picture of a really cute little antique dresser. And I, of course, cleaned it with Crud Cutter, used wood filler, sanded, and with 180 grit, and then also with a buffing sponge sander, and then wiped it clean again, and then let it sit overnight to dry. And then I used Ben white shellac to coat over the whole piece because I was worried about it bleeding. These kind of pieces usually do bleed, and it's just easier to go ahead and prime them first. So going all over with this on the drawer fronts and all on the outside is anywhere where I'm going to paint it, I'm going to use this Ben shellac. And you want to make sure I usually let this dry overnight. It just seems to do better if it can dry overnight when you're done before you start painting. And this Ben shellac is a lacquer-based paint, so it's not, the chalk paint won't reactivate it or anything, but it just seems to do better if it sits overnight. And this piece, I think my husband had to do a few drawer repairs. Not anything major, but just a few. And it's got the original wheels on it too, and hardware, which I usually reuse the hardware if it comes with original hardware. I might clean it or paint it, but I like to try to reuse it, and if someone else wants to change it, they can, but I think it makes it kind of neat. I had so many different ideas to do to this piece, but I ended up getting something new that I thought this would be a good one to try on that you'll see. One thing that this helps with too, I usually use the white Ben shellac when I know that I'm going to paint it a light color if I have some, because I do use both clear and the white because it makes the coverage a lot better. And I am using a custom color for this piece. I'm using Country Chic and Vintage Cupcake, and I am mixing 1 part of the Vintage Cupcake to 4 parts white. And I just wanted it to be a really pale baby pink color with what I'm going to put on it, which you'll see it turned out, I think, really nice. And I'm doing pink pretty much all over, except in the center of the sides, the top, and the drawer fronts. I'm using some white in the center just to make what I'm going to do to it stand out a little bit more, but you don't really have to do this. But I'm just doing almost a monochromatic stripe down the side here later, so I want the pink to just kind of barely show. I don't want it to be really bright. And I'm going to do 2 coats on this for good coverage, and then I have got some Iron Orchid paint inlay in the rose chintz that I'm going to be doing on the drawer fronts, and I've actually laid them out and pre-cut them to fit the insets of the drawers, and to make it easier to place them. And you do, when you get these, want to kind of check and they should be in order, going down and then over to the right and then down. And you want to just check your designs though to make sure they match up the way you think. And then I actually number them so that I know what order they're in. And see, I'm just doing pink around the edges and then white in the center. And you want to do this, it seems kind of weird, but when you're using the paint inlay, you want to have the paint really wet, because that's how it transfers the paint from the inlay paper into the paint that you put on the dresser. So it makes that design in the paint. So if the paint's too dry, it's not going to pull any of that paint from the inlay, which I found out the hard way on this piece, but I ended up having to redo it, which you'll see here what I did, because these are supposed to be reusable, I thought, so I should be able to do it again. And mainly the thing is, you want to make sure you get pretty good amount of paint, and you want to make sure you do it while your paint is wet, because chalk paint dries very quickly. And the day that I was doing this, I was doing it in the garage, and I didn't have the air on because it felt okay when I first started, but then it got kind of warm, so I think that's what dried the paint too quick. But once you put it in the paint, you want to mist it with water, and you can use a rag or a sponge and just press it. And then you let it dry completely. Then before you pull it up, you want to mist it again to loosen it from the paint so the tissue isn't just stuck there, it'll pull off. But you'll see kind of what happened here. You can see how I pre-cut those. That makes it so much easier, because with the paint being wet all around it, it would have been impossible for me to have not gotten some of that inlay outside of those design without cutting it. But you don't have to do this, but I did. So here I'm removing the inlay by just wetting it. And mine, I did have to, again, it was so hot in the garage, it dried pretty quick. I had to use a little bit more water. But see how this look, this is the look you're going to get after you used your inlay, probably like after twice. Probably your third or maybe fourth time you use it, it's going to look like this, which you might be going for this look, and that would be good. So on your used inlays, you're going to get this kind of a worn vintage, more vintage look. But I was looking for something a little bit darker than this. So I'm realizing as I look at this that I'm going to have to probably reuse these again. And It came off better in places, but I knew I was going to redo this again. But I was hoping that maybe one of them might turn out good enough. See, this one seemed like it took a little bit more better. But it's still not really quite dark enough. So what I ended up doing was I let this dry really good. I sanded it and wiped it off, and then I sprayed it with clear shellac, a couple of coats, and let it dry. And the reason why I did that is because these inlays are out of paint. So if I had just tried to paint over top of them without using shellac, it would have smeared all of the red into the white or pink paint, and you would have had red streaks and green streaks in the paint. So you just have to think about that. If you want to redo an inlay that didn't turn out, just make sure you sand it and wipe it off and shellac it first so it doesn't affect your finished look. See, that's kind of how it should look there. What it looks like with just misting the inlay is kind of more the look I was going for. But I think, again, this is strictly because my paint was, I think, mostly dry when I put this. By the time I got this inlay on there, even though I did it right away, it was just too hot in the garage because even the furniture got warm. So that's going to, of course, dry your paint. So now I've already done the sanding and wiping it off and shellacking. So now I'm repainting, starting over. I'm going to use my same pieces that I took off the first time. I'm making sure I'm using a heavier coat of paint. And this time I got the idea to use my brayer, which I don't know why I didn't think of it the first time, but I got the idea to use my brayer and to really rub it into the paint good. So you want to put them into the wet paint first, and I usually kind of press it down with my fingers a little bit to make sure it's on there good. And then you're going to see, I use my brayer even before I misted it because I wanted to make sure it gets into that wet paint. And then I misted it with water. And I think I used a little bit too much water to mist it with the second time because I was so worried about it staying wet to absorb that inlay. So I think you just have to mist it lightly. As long as your paint's really wet and a thick enough layer, you don't want it too sloppy thick, but you want it to be thick. And then I misted it really good. And I used my brayer again. And you can see the water's kind of, I had too much water here. It's kind of coming out, so I was wiping it up, which it didn't really hurt anything. But you definitely don't need to use as much water as what I used. You just need a light spray of water, just enough so that you can see the inlay come through the paper, the design. You can see it dripping a little bit there, but I got it up with a sponge. It really didn't hurt anything. So I'm basically doing the same steps as I did the first time, except this time I got my paint a thicker layer of paint. I was too thin the first time. I think I turned the air on in the garage also so that it would be a little bit cooler and not dry so quick. And I used my brayer. And then you want to do the same thing again, as once you get it on, you want to let it dry completely. And usually you can tell when it's dry because the transfer or the tissue that the inlay is on, you won't be able to see the colors as much when it's dry. It's going to look more like it does right now with the one that hasn't been repainted yet. It's going to have like a wax paper look to it. Of course, the advantage doing this again is that I already had all the pieces really cut out and I could use the same pieces. Oh, I also on mine, and when I numbered my pieces, I also drew an up arrow to indicate which way the design is going, because you're doing this in such a hurry, trying to get the paint, keep it wet and everything, and you're trying to match up the designs and to the area you're doing, that you wouldn't want to accidentally have one upside down, because on some designs it would definitely be noticeable. And again, I'm just doing it with the brayer good, and then I'll mist it and press on it with the sponge, and then just let it dry completely. You can see when it's wet there how the design shows through so much, because it's the inlay is almost like on a thick piece of tissue paper. So the water makes the design come through, because when you put these on, you're putting them on really upside down, because you want to put the bright color down into the wet paint. But once you mist it, the color comes through. And as this dries here, when I'm done, you won't see much of the design that's coming through now because it's wet. That's how you know it's dry. And you will get some wrinkles in your paper, which will show up in your design a little bit too, and it actually gives it a pretty cool vintage look, so that didn't bother me at all. Because this look is supposed to look more vintage. It's not supposed to look like you would use a stencil, say, where a stencil, you can get it to look really exact if you want it, or really pristine. This is supposed to be kind of a worn, vintage, used look. This kind of gives a look of like you hand painted these little roses on here. It really looks pretty. And your pieces that you have left over, little scrap pieces or whatever, you can always use those to do on a bottle or a crockery jar or even a frame. There's all kinds of things you could use these for. And whenever I go to take these off the second time, once these really dry good, I'm going to try to mist them a little bit more than I did the first time, because the first time I don't think I used enough water once I was done and ready to, when they were dry and I was ready to remove them, because getting them wet again is what kind of releases. And I found this little X-Acto knife was handy because I had used the brayer. So this was easier to kind of grab like a little edge of it just very carefully to pull it off. But you need to let it sit for a minute or two before you pull it off to let it get damp enough. And in a couple of places, I think where I didn't have quite enough water, it tore a little bit, but that was my fault for not using quite enough water even. So this is where you do want to use more water. And I just laid them down to dry so that I can reuse them again. You can still see there's quite a bit of coloring on these after using them twice. And I ended up using not quite 5 sheets, but about 4.5 sheets of the pack of 8. So so I think the pack of these was like $48 for the 8 sheets, but I thought since you can use them several times, I should be able to do several pieces with them. And this is the new paint inlay that Iron Orchid came out with, and this pattern is called Rose Chintz. And that's why I wanted this color on this to be very pale pink. Yeah, when you mist these to get them wet to take them off, make sure you don't see any opaque areas on it, because that's where you don't have quite enough water, or it's already started to dry on you. But you notice how good the color is coming out here. You can see how dark that is and how much color is even left on the inlay still. You can see as I'm peeling it off there how much paint is still left on that. So that ought to get a really nice impression the next time. And although I would not be able to use these pieces in the exact same way, you can put them together, line them up, or you can even actually cut these little you could cut individual little rose sprays out and just, put those on the dresser drawer, say yourself, where you maybe won't have quite as many, but it will give you the same look. Yeah, this is exactly the look I was going for, where some of it is nice and dark, but some of it looks a little bit more faded. And once these are done and dry, of course, you could always take a scuff sander and scuff sand over the design, which I actually did a little here, just to pick up any little areas where it might have been higher or raised, where the paint actually was a little thicker in areas. So I did use a sponge sander over all of it, but you can use a more coarse sanding sponge, or like a 200 or something, to actually sand some of it off if you want it to look even a little more worn, like in places. Here's the what the paint inlay looks like. Once this completely dried, I just used a scuff sander just to get off any high places or extra rough places. And then I used clear shellac to coat it again just because I use a water-based sealer and I didn't want it to activate any of the paint in the paint inlay. So I put a good coat on that. And then there were a couple little places where when I lined up my inlay, it left a little line with no color where there should have been some. And I'm not trying to make this look perfect or brand new, but just a couple places here like this white line through the rows. I just used a little bit of acrylic paint with an art brush, and I just filled in a little bit where it was real noticeable. I didn't try to do every single one, but there were only a few of these on the whole piece, so it worked out pretty good.
Yeah.
And I just used a little detail brush.
Yeah.
And again, I want kind of the vintage worn look, so I'm not trying to make it look perfect. I just don't want a real obvious white line through the design to show.
Sure.
And there is the sides where I have, one side where I have it taped up. And again, I'm using the same pink that I painted with on the outside and the drawers and everywhere for the stripes. That's why I did the white kind of in the center.
Yeah, no problem.
To make it even a lighter pink. And when I do my stripes, really, I used to measure it and divide it up and measure the tape and drive myself crazy trying to get it exact. But what I do anymore is I will start my taping and put a row on the left and then the right side and then back on the left and then back on the right. And then I just work my way over into the middle. And if that stripe is skinnier or wider, then that's okay, because you really don't even notice it much. And you could use a stencil if you wanted to. I had thought about using one of my big stencils and just doing a design in the pink down the side, but I decided to use the stripes. I wanted to have a more French look. And then when I'm striping or taping, I always leave extra, usually at the bottom, so you have something, a little tab it makes it easy and quick to pull your tape off. And I was trying to do this so that it kind of has a fade around the sides where the stripes begin, and then at the top and the bottom of the stripes. So it kind of looks like they're blended kind of together. That was the look I was going for. I used my polyurethane for floors, crystal clear satin on this piece. And here I'm just using that on the piece. I've done the same stripes on the other side. And I do 2 coats of the polyurethane sealer. And there I'm using Mama's Butter on the drawer slides, on the dresser, and the drawer slides, and I also use it on the inside of the drawers. And that's made by Dixie Belle. I use the Orange Grove as my favorite scent, but they all smell good. I'm using 180 grit sandpaper lightly to just distress the edges and make sure there's no big little dings sticking out. And once this is all distressed and wiped down, I use clear wax all over because that seals the raw wood that's been exposed from distressing it. There's some, it's not staged very well there, but it's some nice pictures that show the piece finished. I think it looks really pretty. I painted the little front feet white. And there's Miss Bella. She's my big helper. She's our baby girl. And there's the piece all ready to go. And I think it turned out really nice. And thanks for watching this. If you liked, give it a thumbs up and please subscribe if you haven't already.